Welcome everyone to this video where I will be talking about sample size in qualitative studies. Basically, how do you decide numbers and when to stop recruiting participants? And the material for this video is supported by a very seminal work by Malterud and colleagues from 2016 called Sample Size in Qualitative Interview Studies Guided by Information Power, published by the journal Qualitative Health Research, and I included the full reference there for you to go and have a look. So let me start by explaining some of the known challenges related to deciding sample sizes in qualitative studies and why the authors proposed a different concept they called information power as an alternative. First of all, to explain, if you are a qualitative researcher or researcher doing qualitative studies, you will need to plan the sample size of participants you will be using in your research. This should be thought about while planning your study. Then during the research process, where you appraise your sample size continuously, and also to establish whether your sample size is appropriate for analysis and final publication of your results. But for qualitative studies, especially, if we're talking here about interviews, there are no standards for assessing sample size, like say in quantitative studies. This ultimately affects transparency of your research. But to counteract this deficiency, researchers started using the saturation concept to make this issue kind of go away. But the authors of the article, Malterud and others, argue that saturation, this concept of saturation, was originally coined by grounded theory, where researchers Glaser and Strauss did it for a specific type of analysis, and yet researchers started using this concept and applying it in other non-grounded theory contexts without explaining how it serves these other analyses and analysis types. So there is a robust and defensible, there is a need for a robust and a defensible standard. Malterud and colleagues share the view that approximately a sample size is necessary. Approximating a sample size is needed for planning a qualitative interview study design. And I'm talking about interviews here because, that's the way in qualitative research where you have to decide on a number of participants, obviously. So this is inevitable because any proposal, like having a standard, is inevitable. But to start with, to go back to my point, to repeat it, there is Malterud and colleagues share the view that approximating a sample size is necessary. It's important for planning a qualitative interview study design, and this is inevitable because any proposals or departments will ask for an approximate of this, sample to establish whether you know what you're doing. However, Malterud and colleagues added that the final sample size and whether it is appropriate or not must be continuously evaluated during the research process. This is important. Why is that? Because they are basically saying it is okay to start with a sample size, but what they are concerned with and what concerns them in this article is that at what point and why do we say the sample size is enough? How do you justify that? And for that, we can't really say, oh, it's because we reached, the sample size of, say, 15 participants or whatever number. We need to, to have a proper justification, one that cannot be predicted by formula or by perceived, redundancy. So Malterud and colleagues proposed using a new way to decide your sample size, which they called information power. This method is meant to be a checklist. It's not meant to be, a checklist to calculate n, the number of participants, but is meant as a recommendation of what you can consider systematically about participant recruitment at different steps of the research process. It is a concept and method that relies on 5 items or 5 aspects instead of numbers: the study aim, the sample specificity, the use of established theory, the quality of dialogue, and the study's analysis strategy. So let's go through and discuss each aspect, each of these 5 different items, so you understand how to use this new standard of information power. So to explain the first aspect of information power, the study aim. So go back to your study aim and think about it. Is it broad or is it narrow in the context of the subject or the phenomenon you are trying to investigate? Because broad study aims would need larger samples. Depending on your study aim, you may have to choose between hiring more participants or narrowing the aim of your research to keep sufficient information power. Sometimes, however, you may have a specific cohorts or rare experience. Like, for example, you are studying, say, farmers doing a very niche farming practice in a specific small area, geographic area, that is. This would in itself limit the number of eligible participants. So by defining the aim of your interview study, you are in a way also offering some promises regarding the transferability of your findings. Now, let's go through the second aspect of information power, which is sample specificity. As the words suggest, participants, that is your sample of people's experiences, knowledge, and properties, also influence information power. Clearly, those holding, characteristics that are highly specific for the study aim will mean less extensive sample to offer sufficient information power. Specifically here is about participants belonging to a specified target group, while also showing some variation within the experiences they hold so that you can explore, those differences or those variations. This specificity will depend on the recruitment procedures, something to keep in mind, that you do, because you can always go to a group that have experiences of the phenomena that you are studying. But say they are not, patients. They are the nurses who deal with those specific, say, patients, and so on. So in this case, you are targeting a much larger number of participants to cover that topic. But something to watch out for is doing convenient sampling by accepting those available participants, because this may risk a more limited specificity and as a result would require more participants or, a larger number of participants. You would need, in this case, more interviews and participants to get a broad scope of information, sometimes though you get lucky. So keep in mind, sample specificity cannot always be predicted, but can be supported by suitable recruitment strategies. Now, turning to the third aspect of information power, which is established theory. Here, to guide sample size, information power would depend on the level of theoretical background of your study. Normally, having a limited theoretical perspective would usually require a larger sample to get appropriate information power than a study that applies specific theories for planning and analysis of your study. Established theories serve to synthesize existing knowledge and extend the sources of knowledge beyond what is available. While having no theoretical background and starting from scratch would require establishing the foundation for grounding your conclusions. In this case, a larger sample size is needed to grant sufficient information power. Also keep in mind that theoretical frameworks tend to help explain aspects of empirical data through models and concepts. also, small numbers can make a difference if you are looking at something critical to your theory. The fourth aspect that achieves information power that the Malterud and colleagues discuss is about quality of dialogue. So they said strong and clear communication between researchers and participants require less participants as opposed to ambiguous and unfocused dialogues. Getting empirical data in a qualitative study normally requires complex co-construction between you as a researcher or the researchers in general and participants. This means a number of issues determine usually the quality of the communication that is happening from which the information power is established. So the skills of the interviewer, how articulate participants are, and the chemistry between both will determine the analytic value of your empirical data. So it is hard to predict the quality of the dialogue in advance. This happened to me, while I was doing my interviews, and regarding the interview questions that I had and that I asked participants, where I had to define some of the concepts I used differently. In other areas, I found it also easy to connect with participants as I enjoy, chatting with people. And I also have background and expertise in the subject that I was doing my research on and my PhD on. So that helped as well. So having tensions, contradictions, and other issues, perhaps you encounter a participant who is there for the compensation, and or the interviewee is not confident and shy or out of depth, will lead to extended interviews and may need adding more participants. So there are issues or say challenges, let's call them, on both sides, on the participant as well as the researcher side, that will dictate that dialogue and how good that dialogue is. But keep in mind, not challenging your participants and being curious about some of the points they mentioned may risk developing empirical data that hold low information power, which only produces the same kind of information, nothing special and nothing new. Now, the final aspect of information power is about the analysis strategy. So information power relates to the strategy chosen for analysis in the specific study. For example, you would need more participants if you are doing an exploratory cross-case analysis to get sufficient information power compared to a study where you do in-depth analysis of, say, narratives or discourses from few selected participants. If you are doing an exploratory analysis, your aim should not be to cover the entire range of phenomena, but to present selected patterns relevant for the study aim. For example, one good example from one participant may show a typical case, but wouldn't show variations on a specific subject, while two participants with opposed habits may show different aspects of the same phenomena. Yet it still would not be sufficient to hold differences that deviate from the main line, say, of continuum that you're working with. Having, on the other hand, 50 participants may provide all the appropriate variations and deviances regarding the subject, but doing thematic analysis becomes difficult to grasp, to present intersubjectivity, and to organize for further analysis. So this is something to keep in mind, whether it's too little, one case, few cases versus very, very a lot of participants and cases, and how that influences your analysis. So to recap, there are 5 aspects to achieving information power that decides and help you decide the number of participants you should include in your study, or in other words, your sample size when you are doing interviews and so on in your qualitative studies. Malterud and colleagues said that in general, the least number of participants are needed when The study aim is narrow, if the combination of, the study aim is narrow if the combination of participants is highly specific for the aim of the study, if it is supported by established theory, if the interview dialogue is strong, and if the analysis includes in-depth exploration of narrative or discourse details. On the other hand, a study will need higher number of participants when your study aim is broad, if the combination of participants is less specific for the research question, if it is not theoretically informed, if the interview dialogue is weak, and if cross-case analysis is conducted, especially where the aim is to cover the broadest possible range of variations of the phenomena that you are studying. Malterud and colleagues, their advice in general is that all of these aspects, all the five aspects interact. So expect some sort of a trade-off between conditions that need more versus fewer participants. In regards to appraisal of information power, or in other words, how do you know you've achieved, the standard or information power? So this should be repeated along the process. For example, following, say, the first 3 interviews, do a first review of the data and do a first suggestions of relevant theory to check. So here you have it, the concept of information power as a standard that you can use to guide your sample size instead of saturation as proposed by authors Malterud and colleagues if you are conducting qualitative interview studies. This method really shifts attention from numbers to contribution of new knowledge from the analysis that you're doing. The more information the sample holds relevant for the actual study, the lower the number of participants that you would need. While an initial approximate number of a sample size is necessary to move the study along, administrative lines to help you to put, say, a proposal together or something like that, the appropriateness or the adequacy of the final sample size would have to be evaluated continuously during your research process based on these 5 aspects. The results in your final publication will show whether you use an appropriate sample size and that held sufficient information to develop new knowledge in reference to your study aims.